Today's guest is no stranger to the podcast. She's appeared to great acclaim in our first series, showing us what we got wrong about the Middle Ages. Eleanor Janega is back with us today to talk about sex and gender in the medieval period, which she also discusses in her new book, The Once and Future Sex. Be warned, some of the discussion gets a little more bawdy than usual. I did try and steer it away from it, but I think the nature of the subject needs a certain bawdiness. So prepare for a full and frank discussion of sex in the Middle Ages. Welcome to Future Imperfect. It's good to see you again.
Wonderful to be here.
You probably don't really need to introduce yourself, do you? Or do you want to? You probably should, and talk about your book, because that gives us the context. So feel free to take it away.
Yeah, so I'm Dr. Eleanor Janega, and I am a medieval historian, and I specialize in sexuality, gender, and apocalypticism, and propaganda as well in the medieval period. And I'm mostly here to yell about my, in my opinion, excellent book, The Once and Future Sex, Going Medieval on Women's Roles in Society, which is out now in paperback.
And available everywhere you can find good books?
Absolutely. You know, basically, if they sell books, they'll probably have it, is the answer.
That's wonderful. How long did it take to write?
So I actually wrote it in a bit of a fugue state, is what I would say about it. And, I began writing it in the year of our Lord 2020. So I did the initial draft in a year, which was saying something because hilariously, the book itself now is about 80,000 words, roundabout. And when I wrote the first draft, I said to my editor as I turned it in, I said, I'm really sorry. I'm about 20,000 words over the limit. I'm very sorry. And she's like, oh, well, the difference between 80,000 words and 100,000 words is da-da-da. And I was like, oh, I thought it was supposed to be 100,000 words. So I wrote an extra third of a book in there as well. But it's one of those things where for me, it was really a culmination of everything that I'd been studying for years upon years. So I suppose in a way, COVID sort of brought it out of me, kind of like leechcraft or something. So it just kind of had to be brought forth in this way.
Oh, very excited. Where did you go for your sort of resources to start doing the sort of data collection for something like this?
So it's a huge undertaking because when you're talking about gender roles and how the medieval world has created them, really you have to begin in the ancient period. So I was sort of like went around looking at who are the really big sort of heavy hitter thinkers, who are the theologians, who are the philosophers who are writing about women, and then how is this disseminated through medieval culture? And I went to go look at who they were looking at. So I had to do Plato and Aristotle and Galen and Hippocrates, because it's not just conceptions of gender and conceptions of women in the medieval period are as based on classical things as they are on any thinking that anybody is doing at the time, right?
Yeah, because they took a lot of their ideas, didn't they? Direct from or indirect from the classical era, I guess.
Yes. Oh, yes, quite so. The way that they see the transmission of knowledge is that one is standing on the shoulders of giants. That's a medieval phrase. And their idea is that in a Christian kind of cosmology of the world, the way that they saw things was that when humans were in the Garden of Eden, they were in the divine presence and therefore in the presence of perfect knowledge. And so therefore, as the experience of time moves forward, one gets ever further away from perfect divine knowledge. So classical thinkers, even though they are pagan, were closer in time to the Garden of Eden and therefore had sort of better and more perfect knowledge of things. And so one was supposed to kind of take all of that, squint about the paganness, throw a gloss of Christianity on top of it, and bada bing, bada boom, you've got a worldview.
Did they even really acknowledge in the medieval that these were pagan writers, or was it just swiftly skipped over?
So they do acknowledge that they are pagan writers, and then there's a lot of hand-wringing about it. So the thing that they like to talk about all the time is Jesus' harrowing of hell. So, there's that day on Saturday. Jesus is very busy when he's dead because he goes down into hell and he kind of like kicks people out. And one of the things, there are big debates in the medieval period where they say, oh, well, did he go and rescue the pagan worthies, and say, oh, well, it's not your fault, Plato. Come along. It's not your fault you didn't know about me, that sort of thing. But there is some acknowledgement that one can't be blamed for not knowing about Jesus when he hadn't been born yet. So they say, well, surely if these guys were alive today, their superior knowledge would lead them to become Christians. And so you just have to kind of plug God in wherever they say gods. So
Just cross out the S.
exactly. Exactly. So, they're hyper aware of it and they're always kind of hedging with it. And they do have sophisticated ways of looking at these things and they see themselves as kind of in dialogue with them. And, a lot of that work is also done with the late antique thinkers that they also base things off of. So as much as, you talk about Aristotle, you always have to talk about also St. Jerome, St. Augustine, who we call the church fathers. So basically the guys who did all of the hashing out of what it means to be a Christian around about 3rd century, 4th century.
These sources all seem very male, though.
Hmm.
So seeing the world through a male lens, as far as I'm aware, how do you unpick that?
That's a great question. And can one unpick that? That's just the thing. So what you're sort of talking about here is hegemony. And so when I'm looking at a bunch of men, I acknowledge, obviously, there are women who are doing these sort of things in the antique era as well. You have like Hypatia, you have certain philosophers, but they're almost legendary in terms of their status, where one doesn't really get to hear very much from them just because of how far away it is. And because they're still working in the same, well, frankly, misogynistic world. Aristotle himself will tell you that, women are deformed men. They're inside out men. We're irrational. Who would write down anything that a woman said, So there are women in the classical world who do write, but unfortunately, a lot of their work has been lost to us. Now, in the medieval period, we get more voices from women, which is great. So I oftentimes use them almost as a counterpoint to what men are writing. So for every Thomas Aquinas, who's talking about how, women are irrational. They love that. You also have somebody like Hildegard of Bingen, who is writing and saying, well, actually, all of your ideas about how, women are inherently kind of evil or sort of stupid, and this is the way that I see things. Or it's Christine de Paysanne who writes about In the City of Women. In the introduction of it, she talks about how, all of my life I've been told that women are irrational and they're stupid and they're incapable of being able to hold intellectual conversations and they're jealous of each other and they're massively sexualized. And yet I've never seen any evidence of this being the case, but I've been told this by men my entire life. And I think that those things are incredibly useful because it shows that whilst obviously there is a hegemonic way of thinking about gender and a hegemonic way of thinking about women, women are still kind of pushing back against that and saying, oh, really? Really? So, it's just that we don't get to hear from them very often.
Does this sort of gender difference seem to be different pre-Christian? What do we see about the Anglo-Saxons and the sort of Northern European tribes? They come over here, they then get converted. Do we see a kind of a change in attitudes then? Is there something different?
Yeah, this is a great question. Interestingly, there seems to be slightly more difference when we are talking about, for example, the Vikings. And Viking women have a kind of really interesting place in society where they might go Viking, for example. You never know, like a girl might just get in a ship with a sword and who would stop her, kind of a thing. Whereas in a lot of other European contexts, we do kind of still see this sort of idea about, well, I guess what women's spheres of influence are. So specifically in the kind of like pre-Norman context in England, a lot of, again, our records are kind of patchy. It's a very long time ago. The way that we'll know about women a lot of the time is through the process of Christianization, because it's often women who are doing that. It's like Christianity was for the ladies.
Oh, right. Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah. And so you see innumerable, for example, Ethelgiffas or Ethelgiffus, or, they've all got the same name. I can never keep them straight. And they are always the ones that convert. So like Ethelberga of Kent, for example, quite famously, she converts. And then you marry, like the Northumbrian king. And then it's your job to kind of wear him down.
Right.
And this is also repeated on the continent. So, for example, like in a Frankish context, Clovis is converted by his wife. It's very, very common to have wives kind of show up and be like, all right, you need to knock this off now. We're Christian. And that's a really powerful thing. Changing the dynamic of what someone's religion is, and indeed the way that the society will be carried out into perpetuity, is a really powerful thing. So, now we will often say, we call that soft power, right? So women exercise rather a lot of soft power. They exercise a lot of power in terms of, what goes on within their families, what goes on within the social realm. But we just tend to like to look at women who are subverting that. I don't know. There's something about us where we're like, we want a woman to pick up a sword.
Yeah, there is an interesting thought there that in a partnership of equals in different ways, different types of equals. I can imagine those roughy tufty men back then and their influential wives kind of converting them, but with air quotes around it. They
Yeah.
probably they probably wanted a bit more of a quiet life at home, and they were off on campaign or whatever, and still doing more or less what they were always doing. But when they came back home, at the bishops and the ceremonies, and they sort of put up with it for a quiet life, perhaps. I don't know.
I mean, I think that's entirely within the realm of possibility. And, indeed, I think even the process of Christianization is a really complex one, because how much do people really know? At this point in time, too, at this point in time in the Middle Ages, Christianity hasn't even really fully decided what it is yet. We're still having like councils of Nicaea. We're still trying to get rid of, the Arian heresy, for example, which no one has even really agreed on whether or not that's the heresy, So Christianity is still really up for grabs and is very nebulous at this point, in terms of what its understanding is. And there is some question. It's one thing if you live in Constantinople, you probably have your finger a lot more on the pulse and you understand what the latest debates are in terms of Christian thinking. If you live again in Northumbria, this isn't to say that it's completely cut off. You would be surprised. We have bishops of Rome who show up in Northumbria and do big baptisms of the pagans and all of this sort of thing. So it's not a completely isolated world. However, the Bishop of Rome shows up, is like, hey, bada bing, bada boom, you're Christian. And then he kind of wanders off again. And, what they do with that is another question entirely.
Because as human beings, we often are guilty of taking the path of least resistance. And we've all been there in modern debates, and we've sort of gone, you know what, I just can't be bothered to have this disagreement right now. I'll just sort of quietly nod. Maybe it's a dinner party. Maybe you don't want to rock the boat with your thoughts, and you just sort of go, you know what, I'll just keep myself to myself and move on. And everybody goes, well, you were fine with it. And it's like, well, I wasn't. I totally disagreed, but I didn't want to cause a scene. I didn't want to cause a fuss. You talk about the medieval stereotypes as well, and particularly this stereotype which medieval women seem to not recognize, of the sort of lustful woman as well. Could you expand upon that a little?
So this is the way of thinking about women until, the modern period, and a fair ways into the modern period too. It kind of holds true into the Enlightenment. And so again, this goes back to classical modes of thinking. And again, it kind of goes back to Aristotle or indeed Plato, right? So the idea is that the default human is a man. So like in a perfect world, every single person who would be born would be a man. And when you get women, it's because something went wrong. Plato's got a cute allegory about this where he says, essentially, when the world was made, everyone was men. And then if you were not very good at being a man, if you were, sinful or stupid or irascible, then you would be reincarnated as a woman. And that's how you get women, right? So it's like a woman is like a not very good man. And again, Aristotle's like, well, women are inside out men. They're men who got deformed. And so as a result, basically, women are defined as everything that men are not, and usually from a place of negativity. So men are logical, women are irrational, and men are stoic, women are emotional. And as a result of this logic and this rationality, men are able to overcome their base instincts, their bodies, as opposed to women, which means that women are massive hornbags, completely obsessed with sex, and that's all they really think about. And then this coincides with Christian thinking on the matter, right? Because if you slap the Garden of Eden story on top of that, the way that late antique and medieval people think about the story of the fall of man and Eve eating the apple is as expressly sexual. So now when we say that, oh, Eve ate from the tree of knowledge, we say, oh, well, she gained knowledge and insight and they are aware they're naked and that's that. But for medieval and late antique people, what they said was they realized they were naked and she got turned on.
Right. Okay.
They were horny about it. And it's the horniness that's bad. So because women couldn't resist this temptation of the thing that makes you horny, women are the ones who can't resist being horny, right?
Yeah. I mean, A, I was going to say, when was projection invented? Presumably in early antiquity. And B, these men must have been living in societies with plenty of women who weren't like that. And therefore, where did they get these, quite frankly, bonkers stereotypes from? I mean, are they trolling us from thousands of years ago?
Well, I think you'll find that those are the exceptions that prove the rule, you know? That's just basically what they do. And it's very funny because they kind of hold up. It's like the two kinds of femininity that there are, and this is why the front cover of the book in question, it's this great 15th century picture of being tempted by the serpent and eating an apple. And then the other version is the Virgin Mary. So you can choose, right? Because women can either be your mommy or they're sexy who can't who can't. And so they'll talk about this all the time. They'll say, oh well, the thing is, women are able to overcome these base instincts, and in fact when they do, oftentimes they are the most and more virtual people, right? They are the ones who are really able to transcend human things if they can get around it. And then so somewhere in the middle, you then have, as an example of this, Mary Magdalene, who Mary Magdalene is the bad kind of woman, you know, because they kind of roll all of the Marys in the New Testament together and go, yeah, she's a sex worker, although we don't have a lot of evidence that is true. But then she meets Jesus and she's like, oh, hey, no, never mind. I'm on the straight and narrow. And they're like, aha, see, there's another role model for you women. You could be like that. And you could overcome your sexuality and become holy. But what you will kind of see from all these examples is that they are not a group of people who tends to deal in spectrums. It's kind of like, it's one or the other. It's black or white. You're either on one team or you're the other. So it's the when she's good, she's very, very good. And when she's bad, she's horrid kind of model of gender, I guess.
It just still befuddles me. I almost think back in the ancient days, they must have been writing this for effect. You know, is this shock journalism? Are they doing it for the clicks equivalent? Or is that they genuinely believe this? Because it strikes me, they must have been intelligent people. They were writing things. I mean, it could be survivor bias of the documentation, perhaps, because there's an awful lot of documentation that we just don't have. But, you know, they've all got mums.
Well, that's the thing, is that the minute you've got a mommy, she's fine, right? You know, and it's like, oh, well, it doesn't apply to her.
Right. Okay. So your mother is okay.
Yeah, exactly. But, you know, it's an interesting one because, you know, there is something to be said for how social ideals play out too. And, you know, maybe in a world where you're being told, hey, by the way, you are aggressively sexual. Women were like, I don't know, man, maybe I am.
Okay.
Like, you know, there is something about, you know, the permissiveness of a society that's saying, well, this is what you're like, where you're like, well, I guess that's open to me. If you get told by all of society from birth, just so you know, this is how your gender behaves, then you might start behaving that way, right? So there are these kind of social things that tell us what's expected of us. And so it might be that a lot of, I don't know, women in ancient Athens were like, yep, that's me. So,
well, I suppose so. We'll just never know, will we? We'll never know. Is there any sense of us knowing how much information has been lost to us in the past? You know, are we looking at a minuscule fraction?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, most of it.
Right. Yeah, I would agree. I just wonder whether there's any way of sort of doing some kind of projection, because you've got a lot more medieval stuff. And then the further back in time, realistically, we go, the less we have, till we don't get anything anymore now. But there are cuneiform tablets on, you know, from ancient Sumer and things like that. So just surprisingly prosaic, some of those.
Yeah.
It's about, you know, copper orders and people doing things that they didn't want to do. And it's like, hang on, this isn't great writing.
Yeah.
These are work notes. But it always frustrates me that we know so little sometimes. And I wonder whether we're projecting too much from not enough data.
I mean, I agree with you there. For example, when I was talking about the ancient women philosophers, we kind of know, but there's like a big book of like, oh, all of the famous philosophers in history. And there's a couple women sprinkled in there. We've lost whatever those things were. You know, we know they existed. We don't know anything about what they were philosophizing in a lot of cases.
Oh, so we just know their names. They're referenced in other works.
Yeah. So, for example, like Pythagoras's teacher was apparently a very famous and celebrated mathematician and philosopher, and we don't have any of her work at all, which is, you know, hugely blinding. And I would venture to say that if we got to hear from women would be like, probably not, you know, that, which is, I say that because that's what we tend to see in the medieval period. We do see frustration. I'm not saying that, for example, Hildegard of Bingen is a huge iconoclast in that she's attempting to subvert gender ideals. But what she says is you're kind of looking at it wrong. Yeah, okay, men and women are different, but they aren't opposing, they're complementary. And so as a result, these things that you're saying about women being bad, these are actually good things. Like actually it is good to be emotional.
Mhm.
Sometimes it's not bad about the people around you, and then these are the sorts of arguments we see. But again, even when we're talking about classical thinkers, a lot of what we have is because medieval people saved it.
Right. Okay.
So, these are the things that they were like, oh, that's important. Let's go get some more Aristotle. These are the things that I like. So when this comes to us, there is also this mediator in between where sure, there could be a whole stream of ancient thought that goes against this, and medieval people were simply preserving the documents that go along with the gender ideals that they have. But on the other hand, your Socrates, your Plato, your Aristotle, they're a united front on this one. And they are here to tell you that women are weak vessels, And so I'm sure that there is kind of something and someone in there at some point in time who said something good. But, the past is a very far place. Ancient Athens is just so long ago. And it's, a miracle if we find it. Although, I suppose there's been all this exciting work now with the library at Pompeii. And I don't know, there's some AI that maybe is purporting to be useful.
Yes, I'm very excited about that. We might find a whole bunch of stuff which has to sort of overthrow, once we have the evidence, if we have the evidence from those scrolls.
Could be great.
Yeah, who knows? We might have another conversation about that. Could be really interesting.
If I have to rewrite my book, oh no. Oh no, like the second edition completely.
I was going to ask a little bit, but coming back towards the medieval, the idea of courtly love and the idea of sort of nobility and chivalry seem to be about controlling aspects of behavior in an interesting, sort of soft power way. Is that something that's sort of the feminine in the medieval period?
Yeah, I would say so. And I think that kind of what you see in courtly love and, courtly love as a genre being largely written about married women having extramarital affairs does seem rather a lot like, a lot of married women being like, oh, and by the way, it's fine for me to have a boyfriend, that just so you know. And actually, it is kind of cool and good, And so I think that what it's doing is saying, all right, we're not saying that society isn't organized in this particularized way, wherein you're going to have to get married for political reasons. You're getting married because this is a business arrangement. This is what your fathers and brothers want and need. But we are not saying that that completely precludes the possibility of romantic love. And so perhaps this is a kind of carving out of a space for women to enjoy sex, to enjoy pleasure. And indeed, one of the hallmarks of courtly love is that a lot of times the forms of sex that people will be having when they are in these relationships is, for example, not penis and vagina sex, right? Because you do not want to mess up in terms of introducing any kind of incredulity around who heirs are.
Right. Yeah.
So you're having a bunch of different sex that, now we call foreplay. So they're having all kinds of sex that doesn't get you pregnant, which coincidentally are kind of sometimes the things that people with vaginas are into, So it's also kind of a way of arguing for these forms of pleasure that are not linked to fecundity,
Right.
that are not linked to getting heirs. And indeed also for women, let's remember having the miracles of modern medicine are also not linked to you maybe dying in terrible pain, right?
Yeah, I was going to bring that up because having babies is back then is risky today, and back then it was equally risky, if not more so. So you were rolling the dice if you did that. Now you had to, I guess, if you were of noble. I mean, this is the other interesting thing. I wonder whether the nobility is controlled by this, but what are ordinary people? What are the 99% of everybody else doing? They're not looking into courtly love, are they? They're meeting,
They appear to like the songs.
Right, okay.
We do know that the songs kind of go around there, and people do clasp their hands and look longingly into the distance and think about the concept of romantic love. But Especially people of the very lowest orders of society, you're able to marry whoever you want. Like no one cares
Hmm.
what the serfs are doing. Like you usually have to say to your landlord, "Hey, by the way, I'm marrying this person," and then they say, "Oh, okay,
Yeah.
have fun."
It's a formality. Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't apply to them, which also means that for common people, sexuality is a little bit more straightforward. Now, this isn't to say that they don't have extramarital affairs, and indeed they do. And what is Chaucer, if not, a series of amusing stories about extramarital affairs,
It's a bawdy road trip. It's
Yeah,
literally go from one tavern on a party. Yeah.
exactly. And so, there are all these acknowledgments. So, for example, really a lot of the time when you go on pilgrimage, it is a bawdy road trip. Where we get all those great there's these cute pewter badges, especially from the lowlands in kind of like the 15th century, that are like dicks and penis trees and people shagging and vulvas being carried by a bunch of dicks and this sort of thing. And our best guess is, you wear these on pilgrimage. We know they're pilgrimage badges, and it's the equivalent of like a hen's night wearing penis hats or
Right.
something. It's also kind of advertising the fact that you're up for it, because when you're on pilgrimage, you're under a state of plenary indulgence. And it's like, well, what happens on tour stays on tour. I mean, like from a moral standpoint, like from a religious standpoint, you're good, right? Like,
Right.
so people go on pilgrimage to shag. Ordinary people, normal people do this. And, it's the same as going to, I don't know, Marbella or something now.
It's interesting. I hadn't really thought about that from a pilgrimage perspective because I'd looked at it from a perspective of traveling for religious purposes.
Mm.
And I guess for many people it would have been.
Oh God, yeah. I mean, this is to say, of course, there are some people that you're going to meet who are incredibly pious and they are horrified
Right.
that anyone would do such things. But there's plenty of people who are also, way, hey, lads, 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 So,
They're going for the party.
mhm.
Okay, cool. Um, what about medieval beauty? How is medieval beauty kind of different to that we talk about today?
Yeah, this is one of my favorite ones because you can talk about what the standard of medieval beauty is. Now, having said that, it doesn't really kind of get brought into being until around about the 12th century because people just wouldn't describe things. Okay. They were like, no. And this includes, for example, classical writers. If you want to go look at classical descriptions of Helen of Troy, they'll be like, well, she was blonde and very hot. And I bring this up because that's what medieval people did. When they were like, how do I describe a beautiful woman in the 11th century, 12th century? And they find that classical thinkers don't, right? It's very beauty's in the mind of the beholder, and you kind of leave it at that. But when medieval people start to put together their idea of what a classical beauty is, from a literary standpoint, this is written about in particular, there's a book called the Ars Versificatoria, or the Art of the Verse Maker. And in it, it is expressly stated that if you want to describe a beautiful woman, this is how you do it. You begin describing her from the head down to the toes. A beautiful woman has blonde hair, a high, free forehead, which is to say she's got to have like a receding hairline. That's really, really sexy. Skin white as snow, but with cheeks like roses. Sometimes they call this snow and roses. That comes up a lot. She's going to have high, arched black eyebrows, so no monobrow. Eye color, usually gray
Okay.
when they talk about it. Gray is the big one. Eventually, kind of blue, that this will happen.
I mean, the way we talk about colors varies, doesn't it? Because
Mhm.
blue and black are slightly confusing for us. Yeah.
Yeah, they're kind of gray like a falcon is something they say. And it's like, oh, what falcon? Like
Yeah.
sometimes they'll say blue, you're not sure. You then have to have white teeth, sweet breath, lips like a rosebud that pant for kisses, a neck that is long and thin, sometimes like a marble column, sometimes like a swan. On the Iberian Peninsula and among Muslim riders, like a heron.
Like a heron. That's very, very narrow indeed. Yeah.
Yes, yes. And then you have to have white rounded shoulders. Then, in terms of breasts, a brief handful. So small breasts. Then you want to have a luscious little belly. Pot belly, absolutely essential for them. Thick thighs, a big bum, long legs, small feet, hands with long fingers. And that's what a hot woman is. That is how they will be described in literature, and that is how they will be drawn.
Mhm.
That's it. If you see a medieval woman in a painting, that is what she's going to look like. And they all look like that because that is the ideal. Now, that can change occasionally in places where blonde hair is not common. But even Muslim courts and things are like, I mean, if you can get a blonde, that would
Right.
be better. For example, in a Spanish context, sometimes if they're writing about someone who exists, they want to talk about how she's hot. They'll just skip the bits she doesn't adhere to.
Right.
So, if she's got black hair, they won't talk about her hair,
Okay.
but they'll talk about how she does have a pot belly and little boobs and a high forehead.
We see this in illustrations, don't we? We
Mhm.
we often see the high medieval illustrations, and they are like that. They're fairly unusual shape from our modern appreciation of beauty, which in itself is obviously changes from year to year, let alone decade to decade. And I've noticed a lot of the posh ladies, when they're jousting pictures or whatever, they have their hats far back, and they must have plucked their hair out.
They absolutely did. And
Right.
so this is the other thing that's kind of like funny about the beauty standard, right? Because here's this really rigid beauty standard that you're presented with. But then there's also horror at the fact that women are attempting to live up to this. So
Right.
women are plucking their hairlines and they're plucking their eyebrows and they're dyeing their hair and they're wearing powder to make themselves look paler. And you have all these warnings about this form of vanity. So, there's a monk, for example, who has this vision of hell where basically a man really loved his wife. And the monk is like, oh, by the way, I can see into the afterlife if you want me to go check in on her. She died. The husband says, yes, please. The monk finds that she's in hell. And her version of hell is that a demon is gnawing on her forehead and gnawing between her eyebrows because that's where she plucked her hair.
Oh, wow.
So just so you know, it's like this is a very rigid beauty standard that we expect you all to live up to. But I swear to God, if you do anything about that, you are going to hell, right? So it's this real kind of damned if you do, damned if, and this is repeated in religious art. This beauty standard of I paid rather a lot of money for pictures from the Ghent altarpiece that shows this, where basically you've got this parade of all of the female martyrs, and they're completely interchangeable. The only way that you can tell that that's St. Agnes is she's holding a lamb. And the only way that that's St. Catherine is she's got wheels on her skirt.
Right.
They're blonde, they have a high forehead, they have little boobs, they've got a pot belt. This is what they look like. Because there's also this understanding that to be beautiful is to be natural and in harmony with nature, and it shows that God loves you and that you're kind of like blessed. So there is also this, well, if you're not living up to the beauty standard, then that means God doesn't like you and you're not holy, right? But it's like, oh, but don't do anything about it. So the women are put in this absolutely impossible position. And ordinary women even more so, because all of these things that are touted as what is beautiful are impossible to live up to if you're in the field all day.
Yeah, you're going to get browner skin if you're white skinned, and you're going to get tan from the sun.
How are you going to have a pot belly if you're doing,
Yeah.
4,000 calories worth of plowing every day?
Yeah.
Your hands are going to be rough. There's just no way to live up to this. And, that's kind of part of it, right? Where this form of beauty is a form of conspicuous consumption, right? So if you can be pale, if you can have soft hands, if you can have small breasts, which means that when your baby is born, you hand them off to a wet nurse and you bind your breasts up really quickly so that they go back to being small. And so all of these things are ways of saying, by the way, rich women are beautiful
Mm.
specifically, and this does not apply to peasants.
Yeah, so it's interesting. There's a very, very clear social stratification of what the expectations are, certainly from the evidence we have. And I suppose it maps across to today.
Mm.
People look at, well, these days, lots of things are photoshopped. So the person doesn't even vaguely look like that anyway, and nobody could look like it.
Mm.
It's fascinating that the same principles are still coming along. But I want to get back to why a monk would be telling anybody anything about relationships or women in any sense at all. I mean, I've always found this a bit bizarre. They aren't allowed to do certain things, and yet they're giving people advice.
Yeah, this is my favorite. God bless him. Right? So, especially the worst offender of this is Andreas Capellanus, who maybe he's a real person, maybe isn't, who writes De Amore, or The Art of Courtly Love. And he says that he's doing it as advice for his friend Walter. And then he's like, and by the way, here's how you pick up chicks. And it's just volume after volume of essentially it's a pickup artist manual. And it's like, this is how you do it. And then right at the end, the last chapter is like, but actually I wrote this. I've fooled you. Don't do it. It's like, it's very sinful. You shouldn't actually be having love affairs. And it's like, why are you writing about this at all whatsoever? And there's two theories on the art of courtly love, right? There's one, which is this is played straight for the bat, written by some chaplain, some priest guy. Then there's another one that's like, oh, well, it's satire and it's satirizing,
Oh,
people who would write about this.
okay.
But my argument about that is like, well, if it's satire, what you're saying is that there are monks who are like this. There are chaplains who are like this. There are priests who are like this because otherwise it doesn't work as a satire. So
Mm.
it has to be doing that. And similarly, when we look at philosophers from the Middle Ages, they're almost all clergymen. And they are just sitting around thinking about sex and women's bodies and what they should be doing with them or shouldn't be doing with them. And I mean, I suppose for them, it just kind of falls under the purview of this is philosophy. And I'm philosophizing about women. Do they have any business doing that? I would argue no.
Mm.
Like I would argue that people who are not actually in day-to-day contact with women probably aren't able to expound upon what they are or are not like. But sometimes for medieval people, that remove is sort of proof of them approaching this from an intellectual perspective.
Yeah, I get the concept entirely. But if you talked about anything else, somebody discussing soccer, football, and they'd never really watched it and they never really played it, and yet they're giving advice to teams on how the tactics should be on the pitch, and you're going, but you don't know what you're talking about. You just be ignored. And it seems like in the area of sexuality, relationships, that people that don't know anything about it are giving people advice, and it just seems very bizarre. And it's just in this little area.
I would say that also, however, one thing that is going on with the clergy is a lot of them actually are having sex as well.
Well,
So,
this is true. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I suppose it's not quite as simple as we used to think. I mean, in Norman times, weren't people just given bishoprics just to,
Oh, yeah.
just for money, basically? They weren't actually religious in the slightest.
Oh, like completely. It's part of there are any number of reforms that happen, like the Gregorian reforms, happen in order to try to stamp down on this. Like this is what Bernard of Clairvaux is all about. Is trying to stop simony, or the bishops basically given their bishopric to their sons.
Right.
And it's like, oh, this is a nice little business that we have, and they're like, guys, you can't. But even by the time we hit 14th century Prague, one of the really great sources I work with all the time is an archdiaconate protocol. So basically there's a new archdeacon. He goes from parish to parish and says, hey, does anyone have any problems here? And a big problem that a lot of the parishioners are having is that their priest has a concubine. Their priest is running a brothel. Their priest is constantly going to brothels. It's like, and they're over and over. Then they're like, our priest, he runs a brothel. So, and granted, like Prague is, one of the most decadent and huge and important cities in Europe at the time. Like that's maybe not what's happening in Edinburgh or something like that. But when you go to the fancy places, this is what priests get up to. So but having said that, are they theologians? I would argue no. Thomas Aquinas, I firmly believe that Thomas Aquinas was no fun. And indeed, there's a really great piece of marginalia in a book about Thomas Aquinas that I once saw from a student wrote this in a library book in Hull on Thomas Aquinas, where Aquinas is expounding on something in the text, and a student with a pencil has circled it, put an arrow in, and says, yeah, but he's a big fat virgin.
Yes.
I was like, yes, undergrads, that's right. Now that is source critique. I love it.
So you'd almost have a split there between people who were ostensibly in religious leadership, who were theologians, and an awful lot of them who it was just a business.
Oh, yeah. A lot of the time, hey, if you are just kind of like the second son of the family, you're not going to inherit, but you're clever and you want to live quite a nice life. Being a bishop is a great way of doing that. You get rather a lot of prestige, tons of money. You're living a cushy life. You're in town.
You can probably get away with an awful lot.
Yeah, because to a certain extent, the church doesn't want to know about these things. Like one of the things that sort of happens is that the church is like, you're embarrassing the firm if this gets brought up. So say you do it discreetly enough, people will just ignore you a lot of the time. And there are many, examples of this happening. But this is true at all of the high echelons of society. Kings have bastard children everywhere. So do nobles. And this is one of the things about gender standards at the time. Whereas it's kind of like, well, yeah, the ideal is that you do this. But men have a lot more leeway in terms of breaking rules. Like if you're a man and you father a bastard child, that's fine. If you're a woman and you have a bastard child when you're married, now we have a problem. You can just look at the different ways that Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry II are treated, right? So it's like, Henry II is like, here's my collection of several bastard children and my mistress, Rosamund. Hi, everyone. You like that? Whereas Eleanor of Aquitaine, she's constantly in trouble for having affairs in theory, but her husband doesn't. And everyone was like, his girlfriend's nice, isn't she?
So a clear double standard in what people expected, but also what those people involved themselves sort of expected from there. I think that's very interesting. Does it change as you go to the Renaissance and through, out of the what we call the medieval period, and nobody ever woke up one day and said, I'm not medieval anymore?
Yeah.
Um,
Well, interestingly, a lot of these things just embed in the Renaissance period, right? So it's like you will see again, like go look at any picture of a beautiful Renaissance lady, and if she's an idea, she's got the same body, whether it's the Venus de Milo or anyone else, this is the body she's sporting. Now, if it's a picture of an individual, she might have black hair, so that changes. Expectations of women and the way they're seen, they're maintained. People have this really weird tendency to kind of look at the Renaissance as though it's like, oh, and then when you get more classical texts, things are a lot more enlightened. And I'm like, no, they're not, right? They just, you go, is that more Aristotle? He still hates women? Yeah, cool. Like that doesn't help you. Getting more Pliny the Elder is not going to change any of this. It's just now there's more of exactly the same thing. So that doesn't necessarily change things. In terms of the Renaissance, actually, one thing that happens for women is things kind of get a little worse.
oh, do they?
Yeah, there is a lot more. And throughout the modern period, it gets worse again. The Enlightenment is really the worst thing for women in a lot of ways. But one of the things that starts to happen is the way that people look at gender roles is as being quote unquote natural, as opposed to being social categories that are influenced by natural philosophy, certainly, but you also have this theological thing on top of it. And what ends up happening throughout the modern period is women's roles are increasingly domesticated. And so we see a retreat of women from public life and public roles increasingly into the background. Now, this is especially true of bourgeois women. So especially like middle-class women, women who are working in trades or within cities increasingly throughout the Renaissance, and especially actually the peak of this is in the 19th century is the worst time for women.
So the trajectory is not a straight line in a positive way in the slightest.
Nope.
It's got peaks and troughs.
Yeah, and so like what we say, one of the ways that we judge a society is how much freedom women have to run a business or be out of their house or have contacts or friends or people they go visiting. You have a lot more freedom in the medieval period. There's all these expectations that women have jobs and lives and they have a lot going on for them. They travel for work and they do all of these things. And then as the Renaissance sets in, especially for nobility and royalty, these worlds shrink considerably.
Does this have anything to do with the sort of split in the Christian church, the Protestant and Catholic? Is it tied in with the Puritan side of things?
Oh, quite so. Because there's kind of an arms race that happens for the Protestants and Catholics where they're both trying to prove that they are the holiest and that they are the ones who are the real Christians. And part of this is apparently treating women really badly. And the worse you treat women, the more Christian you are. So, this is the period that brings us, for example, the witch panics. And so suddenly, whereas now people are certainly prosecuted as witches in the medieval period, but very uncommonly so. And it's usually men.
Oh, men who are witches.
Yes, because of course there's kind of a sexist reason for that, which is like, well, women, they're not smart enough to go read books and do magic. Like priests are always accused of doing magic because they can read books. And women are thought to kind of do magic, but it's kind of like, well, here's 10 Hail Marys and stop trying to do love magic on people. That's bad, Whereas when you hit the modern period, witchcraft panics are part of this arms race. They're part of this spiritual proving of who takes things most seriously. And, this idea that women would be in league with the devil and that you are cracking down on it and you're going to do something about it is part of this proving ground for modern ideas of Christianity. So, that's one thing that gets a lot worse for women specifically. And that's a modern thing. And yep, that's on us as a society.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think it's been a really interesting, if all too brief, journey through that particular thorny subject. So thank you very much for taking the time to chat. I'm sure we could have chatted for another few hours on the same subject. But for now, we'll leave it there. Just remind people your book is The Once and Future Sex.
Yes, The Once and Future Sex, Going Medieval on Women's Roles in Society.
And what about podcasts if people want to hear more from you?
Yeah, absolutely. You can check out my podcast, We're Not So Different. And I'm also on the History Hit Network's Gone Medieval podcast. So you can hear from me twice a week if that's something that you wish to do.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure.
Thanks so much for having me.